Also to come on the programme, in West Africa, a different kind of war, the battle to contain the deadly Ebola virus. And as the fighting in Libya intensifies, thousands escape west into Tunisia. And in Colombia, victims and perpetrators prepare for peace talks between the government and FARC rebels. Israel's Prime Minister says the offensive in Gaza will continue until it's achieved all its objectives. Meanwhile, the Israeli army has confirmed that one of its officers, who they said had been captured by Hamas, was dead. It says Second Lieutenant Hadar Goldin was killed in action on Friday. He's been posthumously promoted to the rank of lieutenant. A spokesman delivered the family's response to the news.
With great sorrow, the family announces that it has accepted the military's decision in determining that Hadar, a team commander in Givati Reconnaissance Unit, was killed during fighting in Rafah. The family thanks all the people of Israel and announces that the date of the funeral will be announced later on. I'm relaying the request of the family to all of Israel and whoever can come and accompany Hadar, the hero, on his final journey.
After 27 days of fighting, the human cost inevitably is rising. 64 Israeli soldiers have now been killed, including Lieutenant Goldin, and that's almost 5 times the number killed when Israel last invaded Gaza in 2008-2009. 3 civilians have also been killed in Israel, one of whom was a Thai national. But the number of casualties in Gaza is many times that. 1,712 Palestinians have died in the Israeli operation, and the UN reckons around 80% of them are civilians. More than 9,000 people have been injured, and 2,500 of those are children. And more than 250,000 Palestinians are now taking refuge in UN shelters, trying to escape the bombardment. Prime Minister Netanyahu says his main objective remains the security of Israel.
The Israeli army continues to work with full effectiveness to complete the objectives of the operation, which are the return of long-term calm and security for the citizens of Israel, while causing severe damage to the foundations of terror. Right now, our forces are completing the mission of disabling the tunnels, the terror tunnels of the Gaza Strip. So far, they have disabled dozens of them. This harms the strategic infrastructure into which Hamas has invested an incredible amount of effort over the past few years.
Well, Rafah in southern Gaza appears to have suffered the heaviest bombardment since the collapse of the ceasefire on Friday. At least 35 people were killed in and around the area early on Saturday. We have correspondents across the territory, and our first report comes from Charles Stratford in Khan Yunis.
3-year-old Aya's face was burnt because an Israeli airstrike hit her home. Her mother was killed in the attack in the town of Rafah in the southern Gaza Strip. In another bed lies Isra and her daughter Abir. She's had both her legs amputated after her home was hit also.
I was trying to leave the house when the rocket exploded.
Isra's daughter has suffered terrible burns on her feet. Her husband and her son have had their legs amputated as well. Another daughter has suffered serious burns. 3 members of the family were killed in the attack.
There are many injured in Rafah. There aren't sufficient hospital facilities there to treat them, and we can't bring them here.
These pictures were shot by a journalist in Rafah with the Reuters news agency. The town has been virtually sealed off by the Israeli military since the breakdown of the latest ceasefire. We drove south from Gaza City in convoy with other journalists. There was almost no one else on the road. Behind me, it's around 4 kilometres to the town of Rafah, where we've seen this intense Israeli military bombardment over the last couple of days. Now, we've been speaking to both ambulance men and locals that have managed to get out, and they're telling us that it's literally too dangerous to go down there at the moment. This ambulance is one of 2 at the Nasser hospital in Khan Yunis that was attacked as it tried to reach wounded people inside Rafah.
It's impossible to coordinate with the Israeli military to get our ambulances in. It is very dangerous.
Abdullah says a colleague was trying to coordinate with the Israeli military in Rafah when his ambulance was hit.
Rafah, there is no security for anyone to move. There are no taxis, no civilian cars. There are none on the streets. The ambulance had dropped people off at the hospital. That's when the strike happened. The vehicle took a direct hit.
These medics say they will keep trying to get into Rafah to help the injured. Innocent children like Aya, who have no role in what Israel describes as Hamas's terror campaign. Charles Stratford, Al Jazeera, Khan Yunis.
Well, the Emir of Qatar has spoken to the UN Secretary-General in strong terms about the Gaza conflict. In a phone call, Sheikh Tamim bin Hamad Al Thani said he was astonished that the UN had immediately blamed Hamas for violating Friday's ceasefire, and he expressed his regret and astonishment at the UN's silence over what the Emir said was Israel's targeting and killing Palestinian civilians and destroying their homes. Well, Israel has consistently maintained its right to defend itself against attacks, and it's a belief that's widely held in the country. But not everyone agrees with the way the government and the army are handling things. From Tel Aviv, Kim Vanel reports.
Husband and wife Yoav and Alma are Jews and Israelis who say they chose to be labelled traitors to protest against the Israeli occupation. They're anticipating the end of the ground operation in Gaza, but doubt it'll stop the cycle of violence and eventually another war.
For me, it's obvious that things will end only once there is a real democracy here and everybody has citizenship and it's not an apartheid country like it has been for 60 years.
The couple know the majority of Israelis don't agree with them and understand why. Both grew up in Jewish households and took part in patriotic summer camps.
Educational system, it's filled with obviously like the ethos of war and of heroism of the IDF. I mean, the national days, they teach you about the wars from a very specific Zionist narrative. So it's kind of, you can't really hide from it. It's there all the time.
When Yoav arrived at an anti-war protest in Tel Aviv he helped organise, he found police dispersing the crowd.
I realized only when I arrived that the police doesn't plan on letting us demonstrate.
Police were clearly prepared for this protest. They've pushed protesters out and formed a line to not let them back into the square. But you can see they're still here. The message that they're chanting, no, 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 we will not let fascism pass.
A few hundred metres away, people watched on as arrests were made and the protests came to an end. All those we spoke to say the protesters are wrong and Israel has a right to defend itself.
I think the best thing that could happen is that the Hamas regime leaves Gaza and they will have a government that will be prosperous.
Opinion polls say the majority of Israelis support the military campaign, although Yoav and Alma hope that won't always be the case. But they say as long as Israelis feel threatened, critical voices will always be quietened. Kim Vanel, Al Jazeera, Tel Aviv.
Well, around the world there have been protests against the Israeli offensive. Thousands of people marched in the Malaysian capital, Kuala Lumpur, denouncing Israeli attacks on Gaza and demanding an immediate ceasefire. Protesters expressed their anger at the number of women and children killed in Gaza. And thousands of people in France joined anti-war demonstrations in several cities in the country. These pictures are from Paris, which has seen continued protests during the past 3 weeks of conflict between Israel and Hamas. Some of these demonstrations have turned violent. Well, protesters have also been marching outside the White House in Washington, D.C. Kimberly Halkett was at one of these rallies and sent us this.
From the river to the sea!
They came by the busload from as far away as Philadelphia, New York, and Chicago. They're traveling hundreds of miles to send one message to policymakers in Washington. The view among the thousands gathered outside the White House that Israeli use of force in Gaza is out of proportion in comparison to the number of rocket attacks from Hamas.
There have been almost daily protests outside the White House since the start of the Israeli attacks on Gaza almost a month ago. But this is by far the largest, as public anger over the high number of Palestinian civilian casualties continues to rise.
There's really a genocidal massacre that's going on in Gaza, and that people who believe in freedom and justice need to be standing up not only here but all across the world, demanding that somehow human dignity be respected.
There's frustration, too, at historically unconditional U.S. support for Israel. It's a position the U.S. president defends. He says Israel must do more to protect civilians. He blames Hamas for breaking Friday's fragile 72-hour truce.
I think it's going to be very hard to put a ceasefire back together again if Israelis and the international community can't feel confident that Hamas can follow through on a ceasefire commitment.
It's a view these pro-Israel supporters tried to inject into the public discussion unsuccessfully, so police escorted them away. The view of the U.S. public increasingly at odds with the pro-Israel position of their government.
It's not a Jewish issue. This is not a Muslim issue. It's a humanitarian issue, and we have to be here and we have to support it.
I do not want to be on the wrong side of history, and I feel like President Obama is being on the wrong side of history. We don't have to sit here and explain that killing women, killing children, killing innocent people is justifiable in any manner whatsoever.
But it's unclear if anyone is listening. The U.S. Congress has just left for a month-long summer recess, and President Obama on Saturday was playing golf, then celebrating his birthday at Camp David, away from the noise of the protests outside the White House. Kimberly Helkett, Al Jazeera, Washington.